Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to use machine specification and FakeItEasy to do unit testing. So what is machine specifications? Machine specifications is a unit testing framework just like an unit and other unit testing framework. Machine specification is also called MSpecs in short, and MSpecs uses grammar for describing the specifications or the test. The tests written in MSpecs are more readable, it is more English-like, and for our demonstration we'll be using three main classes of MSpecs framework. Number one is the subject. It's an attribute which is used to mark up the class that is in the context of testing, essentially the class which we are trying to test. Number two is the establish. Establish is nothing but a delegate which is used to do the setup for the test, and then we are going to use because, which is another delegate which takes care of the act part of the test. And finally the fourth one is it. It's another delegate which is used for assertion. So let's get started. Once we go through the example, it will be more clear on what is responsibility of each one. So first of all, I'm going to create .NET Core class library. I'm going to name it as mspecs.demo. Once the project is created, I'm going to create my business logic here. So let's consider that this particular class library is connecting to database to do some work. Let's say it is dealing with the database to get the user information. So let's create a class and interface. So we'll create an interface called user provider, which will have a method called get, which will return a user object based on the user ID. For the user, let's say we have two properties, user ID and a name. Now let's go ahead and implement the user provider class. And the user provider obviously needs to connect to database. So in the constructor, we'll have a connection string. And then in this method, we can use a database construct. So for the database, we'll go ahead and add Dapper to it so that we can create simple API to connect to the database. Dapper is a micro ORM, and I have a video on how to use Dapper. I'll provide the link above. And I also have to install the SQL client. Okay, next I'm going to go here and create the code to retrieve a user information from the database. So it's a simple query. It is selecting the user ID and name from the user table, where user ID is the user ID passed, and then it's just returning that user, because I'm doing query fast, so it will return the fast item from the data set and it's returning back. And that's pretty much the code. It's a simple code. It is returning the user object from a database. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a business layer which will take the user ID or user object and do some processing with that. So for that, I'm going to create an interface called user manager and a class associated to that. So the user manager interface has a method called getUser, very similar to the user provider, but user provider deals with connecting to database, whereas user manager will use user provider to get the data from database, but its responsibility would be doing some validation and business logic. For the demo purpose, I'm not going to have any business logic, whereas I'm going to provide some input validation, and that is what we are going to assert against. So I'm going to validating the user ID, and if it is less than or equal to 0, I'm saying it should be a positive number, and that's the input validation. Next thing I'm going to do is get the user object. And here also I'm going to say that if user is null, then I'm throwing another argument exception or an application exception in this case, let's say. So I'm saying user with user ID, whatever the user ID is passed, could not be found, and otherwise I'm just going to return the user object back. So that's a simple business logic here, which is just doing a couple of input validation. We can get, like, this is the place where we'll have other logic usually, right? Like we can have, if the user object has address, phone number, and other things, and based on that we have to do some business logic, we're going to do it here. So the subject for our test is the user manager, because we want to make sure we test the user manager, and that's the subject for our unit test. Since we are not doing any integration test, the user provider class will never be tested because it is doing the IO, it is connecting to the database. So now that we are ready with the class to test, we are going to create the unit test project, and for that we are going to create another class library. So let's go ahead and add a new project. It's going to be a .NET class library. And I'm going to name it as mspecs.demo.test. Once the project is created, there are 3 different NuGet packages that needs to be installed. First one is Machine.Specification. The second one is Machine.Specification.should. Third one is machine.specification.runner.visual studio, and then last but not the least, we need the Microsoft.NET.test.sdk. The last two are essentially used for showing the test result in Visual Studio. The main two that we need for the assertion part is the machine.specifications and machine.specification.should. So once these are installed, now it's time for us to start the test. So for testing the user manager, we are now going to rename this class as user manager test. Now usually when we use things like an unit, we'll have one class, we'll create a test fixture on it, and then every method will be a test. The difference with machine specification is every class essentially is a test. So the way we are going to start is, let's say first we want to test that when user ID is a negative value. So we'll create the class name as such. So we'll say when user ID passed is negative integer. So that's our class, and then what we have to do is we have to specify in the attribute what is the subject that we are trying to test. And now I also have to add the dependency for the MSpecs.demo project that we are trying to test, so that we can refer the class here. And here the subject is nothing but the user manager. So I now define that my subject is user manager, and I'm trying to test when user ID passed is negative integer. So as I mentioned earlier, the four things we are going to use is subject. We have established a subject. Then we'll be using the established for setup. Then because to do the act part. And finally it for the assertion. So let's start with one by one. So first we'll say subject. And remember, every variable we declare will be in static because they are used in delegates. And here we are establishing a context. And it's a delegate. Now for user manager we have to pass the user provider. Hence, we will have to use some sort of mocking framework to mock the iUser provider. And here is the place where we will have to use FakeItEasy. FakeItEasy is a dynamic break framework for .NET for creating fake object, mock, stubs, etc. It's an extremely easy to use faking framework, and FakeItEasy is context aware and it has fluent API, very easy to use. For using FakeItEasy, first I'm going to add a reference to the FakeItEasy NuGet package. So once it is installed, I'm going to declare a fake user provider here. And once I do that, I am now able to pass the user provider fake into the user manager object. The other difference, fundamental difference you might see between FakeItEasy and something like mock is when you use mock, you still have to do a dot object on the mock object when you pass it along, whereas for FakeItEasy, you can just pass it as is. So that's another really easy thing. I felt it's extremely convenient. So now that we have set up the subject, we have established a context. Next thing is to do is to use because to execute the function. So we'll do because of, and now if we pass, we are trying to test the ID as a negative value, which is going to throw an exception. So we have to define an exception first. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to have a static exception, and here I'm going to say because of exception catch dot So I'm saying because of exception, which will be raised by this method, and then I'll do the assertion. I'll say it should fail with argument exception, and the exception should be of exact type argument exception. So you can see the APIs. These are very fluent and very PDD type way of writing test. So we're saying established a context, and then because of calling this method, it should fail with argument exception, and now we're saying exception should be of exact type argument exception. So as you can see, I mean, it's not that we cannot do this with NUnit. We can write similar expressive names of method, but it doesn't come intuitively. Where it's Machine.Spec, I see it coming really intuitively. And again, I'm not saying that everybody should start using Machine.Specs instead of NUnit, but it's definitely a choice, something we can explore. So now I'm going to run the test. And if I open the test explorer, I can see that it is working as expected. And here it will say when user ID passed is negative integer, it should fail with argument exception. You can see how English-like description is shown here out of our class. So this is a fast test that we can do. And then I can declare another class to test the positive case. So now I'm expecting a proper user object to be returned from the method. So I'm declaring a static user beforehand. Next thing to do is establish the context. So establish and inside of this I'm going to establish a fake user provider. And for the user provider, I want to make sure when user provider is called with any integer, it should return a proper user object. For that, I'll do a dot call to So I'm going to say when a user provider is called with any integer, So I'm basically saying that when a call to userProvider.get is made with any integer, just return a user object with a name test. And then finally, to complete the context, I'll declare the subject and pass the user provider fake into the constructor. So now that context is created, it's time to start the test. So I'm going to say because of I'm going to pass 1 this time, which is a valid argument, and for any integer here I'm returning an appropriate user object. So I'm going to say it should return a non-null user let's say user dot should not be null. So you can see how intuitive the names are for the assertion. And the next one, I'll say it should return user name as test. User dot name dot should be equal ignoring case, just ignore the case, but I'm going to pass the proper case anyway. So now I can run the test again, and we can see now for this proper user ID, it says when proper user ID is part, it should return a non-null user. And you can see how it appends the name of the class and the assertion together to provide a proper sentence. And I just really like it, and I feel it very easy for a non-development team also to read the test and understand what is the intent of the test. And for the second one, when proper user ID is passed, it should return a user name as test. So this kind of gives us couple of ways or couple main variation of the test. Next thing I wanted to cover is how do we ensure that the user provider .get was really called. So we can extend this and we can say it should call user provider at least, not at least, exactly once. So this is where we get into white box testing. So we are basically trying to see if it was really called once or multiple times to ensure that the code is working as expected internally as well, not just the returns. So you can say, and this is where FakeItEasy comes really handy. Just have to get the user provider out in this case. Okay, so we can say user provider.get So any integer passed dot must have happened once exactly. So we're going to say the user provider with get method and any integer must have happened exactly once. And this is where we get into the white box area. So I'll run this, go to the text explorer, and here when I see when proper user ID is passed, it should call user provider exactly once. And this is where we get into the next level of testing as white box test and ensuring that inside of user manager, the user provider get was called only once. Now let's say if I go ahead and update and call it twice, my test should fail here. So if I go and run the test again, and we can see it is failing. And it's saying expect to find once exactly but found it twice among the calls. So it is very clearly demonstrating what the issue is. And I'm going to just get rid of these, run the test again, and it should be all green once again. Yeah. So that's all I wanted to cover today. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up and let me know what do you think about FakeItEasy and Machine.Specs in the comment below. If you want me to cover something about Machine.Specs and FakeItEasy in depth, please let me know and I'll be more than happy to cover it. Thanks so much. And if you have not subscribed to my channel and if you're getting value out of what I provide, please subscribe to it. Thanks so much.